I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome to episode 175 of Naked Mormonism. It's so nice to have you here, dear listener. Today we begin part 2 of our discussion with Philippa Meek. How does one navigate the controversial subject of decriminalizing polygamy? What does that look like? What does the legal sphere look like? And how was it prosecuted in the past? A lot of questions, a lot of really big subjects and issues to really discuss. And is decriminalization of polygamy truly the best route to go? Philippa Meek shares a fair amount of her research in this part 2 of our interview, and we really dive into some of these subjects based on her information that she has published in various articles, which, of course, you will find linked up in the show notes on her academia page. So without further ado, let's get to part 2 of our discussion with Philippa Meek. We are joined for part 2 of our discussion with Philippa Meek, a researcher from Exeter University who focuses on Mormon polygamy, Mormon fundamentalism, and how it is portrayed in the media. Philippa, thank you so much for coming back to spend more time with us.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start our conversation today with discussing your presentation at Mormon History Association. I mean, polygamy is and always has been a hot topic in Mormon history, and anytime that presentation is given on the subject at Sunstone or MHA or JWHA, those rooms are often packed. And I wasn't able to get into your MHA presentation because it was so packed, but people that I've talked to who attended it said that yours was one of the best presentations this year. And I have to say, after I read your paper and I listened to another interview that you did on the Classical Ideas podcast, I can see why. You make the case that polygamy is the next social justice issue. And it's thought-provoking and it's very provocative. And I have to say that after reading your paper, I can't disagree with you. But I'm hoping that you can walk our listeners and myself through your thought process here. What does it mean for polygamy to be a social justice issue?
So I see it as being a progression in the sort of marriage rights issues that we've seen in the past. So we had Loving v. Virginia in 1967. Which was a landmark ruling in the Supreme Court that overturned state laws that banned interracial marriages. So there was a couple, a black woman and her white husband had married in a state where it was legal for interracial marriages to occur. They moved back to their home state and were prosecuted because of the laws there. So they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, which overturned all the state laws, and interracial marriage has been legal throughout the United States since then. More recently, we've seen in the case of Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, another landmark ruling, this time looking at same-sex married couples, and that they should be afforded the same rights as heterosexual couples. It also nullified part of the Defense of Marriage Act. And in the dissenting comments in that decision, the Chief Justice Roberts, questions whether the decision could open the door for polygamy, as the arguments used, the 14th Amendment arguments that were used, could equally apply to plural marriage as they could to same-sex marriages, especially with that Defense of Marriage Act wording, which defined marriage as a union between one man and one woman, and that was what was shot down in the 2015 ruling. There was also an earlier ruling in 2013 called Windsor v. United States, which looked at the inheritance rights of same-sex spouses. And it found that, again, it struck down parts of the Defense of Marriage Act, but it found that same-sex spouses were entitled to the same inheritance rights and tax breaks as heterosexual couples.
Which is pretty important. If you're in a same-sex marriage, one of the partners falls ill or gets in a car crash, you want to be considered next of kin or a legal spouse so that you can go into the the hospital and visit them and sit by their hospital bed and, be their power of attorney and be able to direct their assets and be able to have control over the, big medical decisions. Prior to Obergefell, that just wasn't a thing. Cool.
Yeah. And we do have, there are cases where, people were in same-sex relationships and they'd been living together as a couple for decades, and one member of the relationship would become sick and would go into hospital, but perhaps their blood relatives weren't happy about the fact that they were in a same-sex relationship. So their life partner was being denied access to their room because they weren't considered a relative, and they weren't given any power of attorney and so on, because the next of kin, legally speaking, could be a parent or a child from a previous heterosexual marriage, for example, and they would have a say-so in the health decisions of that individual, which is just shocking. So yeah, cases like Obergefell and Windsor, turned those around and gave same-sex couples the same rights as heterosexual couples already had. So I see plural marriage as being the next sort of social justice issue from a marital right perspective, because I see it as the natural progression from allowing interracial marriages, which in today's world we look back and think, why was that even something? Why were people being
crazy.
And why was, and when you look at the data, the polling data of longitudinal surveys within the younger generations, I think it's, and I'm pulling these numbers out of my head, so I don't have the actual figures in front of me, but I think it's something like 96% of those aged under 30 approve of interracial marriages. That's almost universal.
We should really hope that if we give that trajectory with like same-sex marriage right now long enough, that eventually it will get to the same point where people view it as like, why did we ever ban that? Why was that ever a problem? Why did we ever, not allow people of the same sex to get married? And I guess your thesis or your hypothesis is then, not speculation, I guess, but based on the trajectory of this polling data, is that if you zoom far enough out, that maybe one day plural marriage may be viewed in that same vein with almost universal support and question of why was it ever outlawed in the first place.
Yeah, and interestingly, when we look at the longitudinal survey data that looks at interracial marriage and approval ratings for that, approval for interracial marriage was actually very, very low at the time of Loving v. Virginia. And
that was the 1950s case, was that right?
Figures. It was 1967
okay.
Was Loving v. Virginia. So, and obviously today, especially as we're looking at an aging population, that obviously, as you might expect, there's more resistance and disapproval within older generations. But obviously, if we're looking at, people under the age of 30 having almost universal support, that's only going to increase over all age groups as the population ages. The same with same-sex marriage. Support is more prevalent in younger generations, which is what we might expect to see. Currently, within recent longitudinal survey data, which has asked questions on how people feel about plural marriage, we're looking at about 20% of those who've been asked who approve of allowing plural
I'm actually
marriage.
surprised that it's that high.
Not a bad number.
If I'm honest, I'm surprised that 20% approve.
So we've seen a couple of sort of blips in the numbers over the years. There was it kind of went in the reverse around the time when Warren Jeffs was in the media. As you might imagine, we also saw a jump from 7% to 11% after the first season of Sister Wives aired. So I don't think that's a coincidence. I think people watched that, and actually, and Big Love also has a big feed into that as well. People are suddenly seeing these representations of plural marriage as being just like any other family, just with more people in it. And they think, well, actually, it's not this sort of crazy lifestyle that we saw with Warren Jeffs and underage marriage and abuse that, you know, that has previously been seen in the media. There are, you know, consenting adults entering into plural marriages with eyes wide open that occur and that, you know, they function.
So hang on. So just to translate this to, you know, my hamster brain here, you're basically saying that the correlation we see of approval of polygamous marriages on public polling data rises and falls in direct correlation and probably causation with what national media is saying about this, whether that was negative in light of Warren Jeffs being on the top 10, you know, FBI most wanted list, or positively when it was portrayed like in Big Love and in Sister Wives. There's an actual causal effect on society there.
I believe so. I can't know for sure without asking the people who were polled in those surveys whether that was a basis for their decision. But, you know, I can see, you know, if you have something that's rising by a percentage point or staying steady over a number of years, and then it jumps from 7 to 11% after the first season of Sister Wives aired, I feel pretty confident in saying that that has had some impact and influence. So I think public perceptions are very much informed on what people are seeing on television and in the news media, and also the opinions and the sides that the news media takes. Excuse me, digressing slightly, when we saw things like the raids on Short Creek in the 1950s and the raid on the El Dorado ranch out in Texas, excuse me, in 2008, the media initially was sort of othering the polygamists, but actually after a while, when they saw that, you know, the children were very clean and well looked after, well fed, that the homes were well looked after, the same in 2008, you know, all of the children actually suffered more in the foster homes that they were placed with after the ranch, after the raid on the ranch, than they ever had while living there.
And that says nothing of like the trauma that impacted them of the government ripping kids out of their arms of their mothers. I mean,
yeah, and in some cases, you know, nursing infants who were still nursing were being, you know, torn away from their mothers and put into state care, all on the basis of a prank phone call. But that all of that was to say that, you know, the public perceptions are based on the news media, and the news media very quickly turned around and said, well, actually, these people are just wanting to live their lives and, you know, practice their faith. Why is this such a problem? Why are they being persecuted for it? So we are seeing changes in the way that many media outlets are portraying these cases. So I really do see it as a social justice issue, and I see it following in the footsteps of, you know, the interracial marriage and same-sex marriage civil rights cases. And I do see this as a civil rights issue as well, and a religious liberty issue too. So where we've seen Loving and Obergefell use 14th Amendment arguments in the cases, I think we also have First Amendment issues that we can also bring in from a plural marriage perspective, because the majority of people who are practicing plural marriage are doing so based on their religious faith tradition.
Okay, I want to discuss the grander scheme of general progressivism, because I mean, you said that it's generally the people who are opposing polygamy and opposing generally what we consider civil rights issues like, you know, same-sex marriage. They're the older generation, people who are, you know, demographically speaking, more likely to be conservative, more likely to be, you know, Republican and vote red. But there's a certain tendency that society in general is moving towards more progressive and liberal ideals. And that comes to the way that people view premarital sex and interracial marriage and having children out of wedlock. And many of these issues that can be quantified in polling data by simply asking how people feel, if they are favorable towards or indifferent towards these issues, as moral questions. And you document just in the past 20 years, basically from the early 2000s into the late 2018, these various markers of what we consider social justice issues progressing towards more tolerance and acceptance. And very briefly, you also include the polling data of how people consider what polygamy is, whether or not polygamy is accepted, and see very similar trends of the larger progressive movement mirrored within the way that the public views polygamy as well. So I guess, I mean, this is obviously highly speculative, but based on what you see from the current polling data, if we were to extrapolate the trends far enough out, in what century will we consider polygamy to be just, the way that we look at, interracial marriage today?
I think by the end of the 21st century,
wow,
certainly.
Really?
I think...
Wow.
Yeah, I think we could even be looking with it. Well, I don't. I mean, this is speculation, but I think it'll happen sooner than we think, and I think it'll start from. It'll start on a state by state basis. I think we'll see a lot more toleration, and I think we'll see a lot more bigamy statutes being revised and reworded so that they specifically look at cases of it allows for prosecution in cases where a man or a woman is living two separate lives, has a family or two families who don't know about either of each other, and they are living in the classic definition of what bigamy is, which is maintaining two marriages unbeknownst to one another. That, in the spirit of the law, that is what bigamy should be prosecuted under the circumstance that bigamy should be prosecuted, where there has been true deception involved. In cases of plural marriage, yes, there is bigamy going on in a technical sense. If you define that as, looking at, even if a family has one legal marriage and then the additional marriages are spiritual only, they're not breaking the law in that they don't have multiple marriage license, which would be cause to prosecute under the bigamy statute. But they have, multiple spiritual marriages. So I see, bigamy statutes being changed so that deception has to be present in order for prosecution to go ahead. So you're not going to see, and we aren't seeing very many people being prosecuted for polygamy under bigamy statutes today. Right. I mean, there's been less than a dozen cases in the 21st century in Utah. And those that have ended up with a prosecution and ended up going to court have really only been where people have been they've been prosecuted for other crimes as well. So
like fraud or
underage sex or fraud or other, neglect, that kind of thing. And the sort of bigamy thing has been tacked on as an additional crime. So I think we'll see bigamy statutes changing, the wording of bigamy statutes. And in fact, it did change in Utah very briefly because the Brown family of sister wives, they took a case out against the state. Well, it was Brown v. Berman, where they challenged the constitutionality of anti-bigamy laws as they apply to religiously practiced plural marriage. The lower court actually said, yes, you have a case. Let's get rid of this sort of purporting to be married, and the cohabitation clauses that they had in the Utah bigamy statute. However, that ended up being overturned in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals on the basis that, so the 10th Circuit said, well, actually the lower ruling shouldn't have been, it should have been dismissed because the Browns didn't face any real threat of prosecution because the state attorney general had said that he wouldn't prosecute people unless there was evidence of other crimes. So
and
the
that's
argument
notable.
was, well, they never faced a real threat. And the other part of it was that they know the Browns, after the first season of Sister Wives, left Utah because they felt so that, they would have police cars come and park outside their door, and they'd be like, well, this hasn't happened before. So they ended up moving to Nevada. So the other point was, well, the case is moot because they no longer live within that jurisdiction, so they can't possibly be prosecuted under Utah law because they aren't residents of Utah. So the 10th Circuit actually overturned that ruling. So then in 2017, Utah House Bill 99 changes the bigamy statute in response to that result. So it actually, from the 10th Circuit, the Browns actually tried to take it up to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear it and didn't comment on the case.
They denied cert.
Didn't refuse to hear it. So that could have been the chance for it to be debated in the Supreme Court, because a lot of the cases that we've seen in recent years and in the 20th century have been using this sort of flawed legal arguments that have been enshrined in precedent in case law, like Reynolds, which argues, well, there's no First Amendment issue here, but it's all based on flawed law and precedent. So only SCOTUS can overturn that. So, or unless it comes from the legislature.
Well, okay, so let's discuss that hurdle, because when it comes to Utah and various other states, it's written into the state constitutions, marriage is to be between one man and one woman. And, the LDS Church in 2008 supported, Proposition 8 in California that was a constitutional amendment that was supposed to declare the state of California Constitution to be marriage is only between members of the opposite gender. So there are constitutional amendments that can be made. And in a political sphere that appointed the current litany of very conservative originalist Supreme Court judges, it doesn't seem like a very tenable solution to say the Supreme Court is going to, rule in favor of these. It seems like amending state constitutions at the state level is where this fight needs to begin to happen, and eventually that can arise up to the Supreme Court. Is that flawed logic?
So I have to say I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a legal expert per se. But although I do know a lot about this stuff, I'm not sure that a state can change its constitution. For example, the Utah Constitution, the way it's worded to prohibit polygamy forever, I'm not sure that the legislature can just vote to take that out of the Constitution. But I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I don't know for sure. I know that in states such as Arizona, the Arizona Constitution does prohibit polygamy. But actually, the attorney general for the state has actually said, well, I can only enforce law that's been put through the legislature. So actually, in the Arizona bigamy statute, there isn't this kind of cohabitation or purports to be married clause. So therefore, in Arizona, in order to be prosecuted under bigamy, there has to be more than one legal marriage at a time for people to face prosecution. Whereas in Utah, the state bigamy law statute says that you can have more than one legal marriage, you can purport to be married to more than one person, or multiple cohabitation comes into play as well. So there are states like Arizona where it's prohibited in the Constitution, but actually, their state attorneys are saying, well, actually, I'm not going to prosecute based on something that's enshrined in the Constitution. I'm only going to prosecute based on the laws of this state and that the legislature have passed.
Well, that's quite notable as well, because I mean, for a state constitutional provision to be overwritten, it just requires another amendment. So, by a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives and the state Senate, Utah or Arizona could just amend their constitution to nullify those passages, those provisions that outlaw bigamy or polygamy, but that requires a 2/3 majority. And given the way that just the general public views it, it seems like politicians are going to be a lot slower to jump on the bandwagon to get over that 2/3 majority in order to pass a pro-polygamy or an anti-non-bigamy provision in the Constitution. I think I said that right.
Polygamy, something that prohibits polygamy in the
Thank
Constitution.
There are some ways to navigate this, but obviously it's going to differ state by state, and it seems like they still need to overturn that old Supreme Court ruling of Reynolds v. U.S. With George Reynolds, because they said that you don't have the religious liberty to practice this because it's one of the twins of barbarism.
So this is where we get into the sort of idea of decriminalization versus legalization.
Yeah, let's have that conversation.
So you can change the bigamy statute to say, okay, well, it's only when there's deception involved and there's more than one legal marriage, which then allows the decriminalization of polygamy that's practiced where there's one legal marriage and multiple spiritual marriages that are only sort of valid within their faith tradition. So that we're sort of in an era of sort of toleration at the moment, where there are states where they're coming out and saying, well, I'm not, Utah has said, we're not going to prosecute someone for practicing plural marriage just for the sake of them practicing plural marriage. If they're committing food stamp fraud, or they're abusing minors, or there's domestic abuse, or any other sort of crime, then we will press charges under the bigamy statutes. But otherwise, your Joe Daggers of the world are not going to be prosecuted. But there are people, there's people that I work with who, despite the fact that the Attorney General came out and said that, still live in fear of, putting their neck on the line and sort of being too vocal and advocating for their rights, because they don't want to be investigated. They don't want the police showing up at their door, asking them questions, because they're committing a felony that could put them in prison for 5 years and have their children taken away from them.
And the promise of one politician to say, I'm not going to prosecute you, that at the end of the day, that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee. Like, that really doesn't mean a whole lot.
So in the defense of the Attorney General who made that statement, he said it under penalty of perjury. So, he could go to prison himself if he's actually no longer the Attorney General. But the current Attorney General's office in Utah hasn't said that it would change that position. And in fact, it does seem to they haven't prosecuted anyone without other associated crimes. So, for example, Thomas Green is one example where he was prosecuted. Home was another one, but they were prosecuted there were other crimes that were actually more serious, and the bigamy thing was just tagged on. So I think we'll see legislatures changing the bigamy statutes. So then we'll get into this sort of decriminalization position, which is not ideal, but it does mean that families don't have to live in fear that they could potentially be prosecuted under the bigamy statute and go to prison for 5 years and have their children taken away from them. That's good. They could continue to live in the current situation, but additional marriages wouldn't be legally recognized, and therefore wouldn't. With that comes a whole host of other protections too, such as access to Social Security benefits, pensions, health insurance, inheritance rights, and things like that. And a lot of plural families, employ lawyers. Especially in Utah, there are many lawyers who are, adept at writing up sort of living wills and other arrangements, so that if something happens to one spouse, the other spouses, will have custody of children and so on, and inheritance rights for the children and so on. People are making these legal documents that give their children the protections that they want them to have, but it still doesn't, it still prevents people from having their second, third, fourth wife named on their health insurance. Which is very tricky if you are having women who are second, third, fourth wives who are having more children, because they're then having to look to the state for help, and then could open themselves up for prosecution if they are claiming benefits based on a status as a single mother when they're actually purporting to be in a plural marriage. So people are then getting in a gray area, and it becomes very tricky for the poorer families of how do they afford to maintain their lifestyle and their marriage based on their religious convictions, because the laws that are out there at the moment aren't offering them the protections that a monogamous couple would have for their children and Social Security as a fallback if someone becomes unemployed and so on. So I sort of digressed a lot there, but I see this sort of decriminalization, and then I think we'll see at some point we'll start seeing a flip, and this is going to happen in some of the more liberal, bluer states. Perhaps California could pave the way, where we'll see states legalizing the issuance of multiple marriage licenses,
which is essentially legalizing polygamy, but it's not doing so by amending state constitutions that outlaw polygamy. It's not doing so by challenging at the Supreme Court level all of the old 1800s Supreme Court cases that are anti-polygamy. It's just kind of subverting the issue. And eventually something will happen that will come up, and the legality of those marriage licenses will eventually have to be taken up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, because Reynolds does need to be overturned, and that's going to be the big thing. So I think if we see some states who legalize it and issue multiple marriage licenses, we will then have these people who are consenting adults who are entering into plural marriage saying, well, if my marriage is recognized in Vermont, for argument's sake, then why can't my plural marriage be recognized in Alabama or Nevada or somewhere like that? And so then we'll see challenges to those other states' laws, the same way we saw with Obergefell, where a marriage entered into in one state wasn't recognized in another. And so then we'll see we'll see sorry, I just got caught up there checking a reference. So then we'll see states, the challenges going to those states that haven't legalized it, and that's how we'll see it get to the Supreme Court.
And then we'll have something similar to Obergefell, because that's exactly what happened there. Right.
So that's what I can envisage. Obviously, we now currently have a very heavily stacked conservative Supreme Court that is not going to be quite as easy to pass something like this. They're not looking at those progressive issues in that way. So it's about timing. So I think, if this all started happening in the next 5 years, I think we would have to be very careful, or the people involved in this sort of motion would have to be very careful in timing it right to hit the correct courts at the right time in order to have Reynolds ultimately overturned, because all it needs is for an appeals court to say no. The objection to legalizing multiple marriage licenses is upheld. We are not going to allow that. And then it's a step backwards. Sometimes you do need to take a step backwards to go forwards. And I'm not saying this isn't going to be a rocky road, but I think if in today's current Supreme Court, I'm not sure that it would pass, even though the legal arguments are there. There's quite clear issues and problems with the Reynolds decision, and we have clear points of law, which, we've got 4 prongs, really. We've got 2 in the First Amendment and 2 in the 14th Amendment that can be really, really strongly used to argue for the unconstitutionality of banning plural marriage. But it's really about how that Supreme Court interprets that and chooses to rule on it. And at the moment, I think with the sort of conservative leaning Supreme Court, I'm not quite sure that would get passed. I think we're probably looking a little bit further down the line with a perhaps more equally weighted or even a more liberal court making that decision.
I love that this seems to be a bit of a paradox, because arguably many of these cases that are coming forward, many of the people who are prosecuted under this are practicing plural marriages as a requirement and a right of their religion. And typically it's understood that the Conservative Party is the religious freedom party. The more progressive party in America here is the party of separation between church and state. But we have people who are saying it is my religious liberty to be able to practice polygamy. But at the same time, that runs counter to basically the religious practices and the religious tenets of most other mainstream religions here in America. So it's an idea of competing religious practices. Which one is superior? Which one is therefore legal by way of being superior? And when I say superior, I'm using that as an antiquated term. I don't agree with the terminology, but that's the way that it is perceived. And really, the only way that I can see this coming together in a way that doesn't create that the religious freedom part of it is that this needs to be argued under secular means, that it isn't a religious group, or it's not a practice of my religion that I'm doing this, but that there is just no basis on civil rights grounds to bar me from having a polygamous relationship. And I mean, obviously, having the religious aspect in there in the current Supreme Court probably is more favorable to getting a pro-polygamy ruling, but I also see that there may be a need to not have the religious component be a part of the argumentation made, because then, well, we're making laws and we're hearing laws based on religious ideas, and those can be overturned when that religion is no longer in a majority or no longer has power. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, what's even more interesting for me, and it's something I've sort of done a little bit of research into, and it's quite interesting, is the evangelical vote. Obviously, evangelicals are very big within the Republican Party, who are mostly, against things like same-sex marriage and plural marriage and other sort of non-traditional marriage forms. Let's say. So, but the interesting thing with the evangelical vote and this idea of, looking at the biblical, what's in the Bible, and you have a lot of evangelicals will argue against same-sex marriage, arguing, well, it's not allowed because the Bible says so. And, well, the Bible says that polygamy is permissible. So like one of my kind of interesting things, and I'd really like to sort of sit down with some evangelicals and ask them, would be, well, it's all about what is written in the Bible.
Let's crack that thing open. Let's see what it has to say.
So let's go and let's go back to the original ideas of biblical marriage, of being polygamy, because that's right there in the text. And so I think evangelicals would be very hard pressed to find a biblical argument against plural marriage, because it's right there. But I would be really interested to see the stance that they would take, because it's this paradox that you mentioned, where it goes against the sort of liberal sort of sensibilities that they're opposed to. I mean, I'm talking very broad strokes here, but it's something that's so central in the Bible that they can't use the sort of Bible arguments they used with same-sex marriage in the case of polygamy, because biblical polygamy is a thing.
Absolutely.
And I have written a couple of little papers and presented a couple of papers on that sort of evangelical thing, and the sort of paradox between the LDS Church and an evangelical church of where they stand on issues. And obviously, we know what the LDS Church thinks of plural marriage.
Actually, that was what I was going to say is I would love to see the amicus brief that the LDS Church files when a secular or even a fundamentalist Mormon group eventually gets to the Supreme Court with challenging polygamy. I would love to see what the modern day LDS Church says about this, because they have the manifestos that are part of the first manifesto that's part of the Doctrine and Covenants, but they also have D&C 132 that requires polygamy to get to heaven. It requires it. So not only do they have the Bible to contend with of biblical polygamy, but they have their very own modern day scriptures that have never been overturned that says it requires, like, we have to be polygamous to get in to make our own planets. I'd just be very interested to see what they would have to say about this, or if they would try and stay out of the fight, which seems unbelievable to me.
Well, and so I do wonder. It's all speculation, and we can we can always think of different things. But I do wonder if, like, maybe, it's really up to the sort of the leaders within the LDS Church. But I do wonder if maybe they would be like, well, let's just see what happens, because if it gets overturned, then we might just bring back, polygamy. And I think there. It's a thought, and it's fun to think about. In reality, do I think that the LDS Church would suddenly turn around and be like, we're going to practice polygamy again? No,
they're too
because
conservative.
I think there's so many strong feelings. But then when you look at actually, data that is, when we look at what young, like millennials and Generation Z or Generation Z LDS Church members, how they feel about issues like same-sex and plural marriage, they're actually pretty pro. So I do wonder how things, might change in the future.
That's a good question.
And I do hope that I do live to see the day when the LDS Church starts adopting plural marriage again.
Hang on.
Do I think it'll happen? It's probably going to be. It's probably going to be extremely unlikely, but it would be fun if it did.
This opens a massive question, and it has to do with the gender dynamics that exist in the modern day church, where a man holds dominion over his family. And it's this very old school gender role ideas that the man is the breadwinner. He's the provider for the family. He is the one who, like, his word is the final word. And women are supposed to be the emotional support. They're supposed to raise the kids. They're supposed to do the chores around the house. These old gender norms that we picture from 1950s houses with a white picket fence. This is what we see in Mormonism today, in Mormon culture today. These cultural gender roles survive to this day. And that leads to a massive question. Is there a hypothetical world in which Mormon polygamy is truly equal? Given the culture, given the doctrine and theology where the man is the one who ascends to his, to the celestial kingdom, and then he pulls his wife or wives through, given the way that men are supposed to be the directors of the family and hold dominion over them, is there any possibility that Mormon polygamy will be equal?
I think so. And I think it already is in many ways. And again, looking at it from the position of a lot of women that I've spoken to, yes, they are holding very traditional gender roles. They're stay-at-home mothers, and so on, a lot of the times. And we do see, the same things within fundamentalist Mormon groups as well, as far as these traditional gender roles working out. But a lot of women just don't have a problem with that. And I'm like, well, that's fine. I tend to be a little bit more traditional than some of my sort of feminist counterparts might feel about certain things. So, in an ideal world, would I love? Well, no, because I love my research too much. But would I completely rule out the idea of being a stay-at-home mother and having dinner on the table? I probably wouldn't mind that life too much. That's not what I'm choosing because I love my research.
You are
so
allowed
much.
to make
But
the
I have
choice
the
yourself.
Choice. But then a lot of fundamentalist Mormon women do have the choice, and because they're choosing plural marriage, they are in positions where they've got a network of sister wives who can share the household responsibilities, whether they're all living under one roof or if they're living in separate dwellings, where they can take it in turns, where one woman is a stay-at-home mother. If she has a young baby or an infant, she can look after the other younger children who aren't old enough for school, while the other women go out to work, and they can take it in rotation, take it in turns as they each have
because
children.
the one income household is a relic of the past now.
Right. So, and even within, with the LDS church, we are seeing that LDS women are amongst the most educated in the United States. And I think the exception, Hindu women are the most educated, I think, based on Pew Research data. And I don't have it in front of me, so I might be wrong on that. But I think it's Hindu women are the most educated. But Mormon women are very well educated. Most Mormon women hold a degree. And it's not quite that way in the fundamentalist communities. Many fundamentalist women don't go to university, but they have the options to and the choice to, and are more often and more frequently choosing to do so. The other thing as well is that a lot of Mormon women, both polygamists and monogamous, are marrying at a very young age. So it's not outside of the realms of, to be able to have their family, have as many children as they want, and then go back to college in their late 30s. I mean, I'm 37 later this year, and I'm old enough to have been married and have an 18-year-old child starting college this year, if that was the path I'd chosen and taken in life. So,
choice,
I could be...
Choice is such an important word in what you just said, that you have chosen.
But there are, there's evidence that a lot of women especially who are joining fundamentalist groups, are doing so because they see this idea, the men are, they've already been tried and tested as a husband before. So they know that these men are good husbands and fathers. They know that there's financial security there. And we actually see, is Janet Benion, who wrote some research on I think it's specifically looking at the AUB, where women are converting in quite high numbers comparatively to male converts. And the women who are converting are doing so because they're getting to a certain age and they've never had children. Suddenly, if you're a member of a fundamentalist community, not only are the single men available, but every man is available. So your options as a woman are quite big. If you're a man within a fundamentalist Mormon community, the choices of women you have available for potential spouses is limited. For a woman, anyone is game. So why would that not be great for women to have their pick
and
of the lot?
Considering this is possibly this may sound flippant or dismissal. That is not the way it's intended, but I'm going to say it anyway. For women who are within the confines of a largely heterosexual society and who may not be heterosexual themselves, the day-to-day roles and dynamics that exist in polygamous households may be really great for them. So, just saying.
And especially women. Yeah, and there are small number of cases that I've come across of women forming their own sexual relationships with each other within fundamentalist Mormon marriages. Obviously, that goes against the teachings of the specific groups, because it is the heterosexual norm. But there is a case, and again, it's in one of the books written by Janet Benion, where there is a case of two women who met each other in a plural marriage. Their plural marriage wasn't going well, and they ended up leaving their husband together with their children and married each other. Okay. So, there are, and again, people who, there are cases of people who feel because of their religion where they do need to sort of stay in the closet maybe, or they choose to do that. The fact that they are sharing their husband with multiple other women means that their marital obligations might only come round once or twice a week. So that gives them a little more freedom. And so you do have women who choose to join plural families because, they do want that independence. They want some space where they can explore themselves as a person and the female networks that are available to them, without needing to constantly have, a man in the house 7
Right.
days a week putting food on the table. And then they often, the women that I've worked with often say, then I value the time that I share with my husband more than if I saw him 7 nights a week.
Interesting.
Because we know that the days that we do get to see each other, we get to value every single second that we spend together. And, we make, it could be date night. We make a special meal. We do special things together. And they see monogamous relationships as lacking in a lot of ways. And I've got to say, when I've looked at women in plural marriages, I can see where they're coming from. It's not the choice that I've made for myself. I don't want to enter into a plural marriage, but I can definitely see the things that attract people to that lifestyle, and the women especially who are converting to fundamentalist Mormonism in order to practice plural marriage.
I understand that, and I think it's the important point that that both of us are trying to reiterate over and over and over, is that the power of choice always needs to be present, and the ability to agree or to deny consent in these situations always needs to be present. And I guess for myself, I just think that given the power dynamics and the male superiority of Mormon doctrine and theology, that it makes the idea of informed consent and the question of that a lot more complicated, and in some cases maybe not even possible. And I think that's revealed by the parameters in which we've been having this conversation have been limited strictly to the idea of one man with multiple wives. The conversation is not going the other way, which reveals this gender imbalance that is inherent in Mormon doctrine and the practice of Mormon polygamy. And I guess that kind of goes into my question of, is there a situation in which Mormon polygamy is truly equal? I believe that would have to incorporate an idea that gender is not a determining factor of where you sit in this relationship, where one woman can have multiple husbands, where the system of polyamory that way, or polyandry that way, is viewed as equal as polygyny of one man with multiple wives. And that, of course, once again, this conversation is giving into the parameters of strict, binary genders, which is not the case, which opens up a whole litany of other questions as well.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's sort of two things to come out of that. One of them I'd sort of push back slightly and say, yes, there is the idea of it's a very patriarchal structure, but you have one man and multiple women. Now, those women have a lot of power within that relationship because the man is outnumbered. So they collectively have a lot more bargaining power than it might sort of automatically look like on the
But
on the
he
surface.
has the priesthood.
He does have the priesthood, but the women are in a position where if one woman feels aggrieved for whatever reason because of the way her husband is treating her, she has the power and the ability to speak to her sister wives, who can then take her side, and together they can work together to put pressure on their husband to make him change his behavior.
That's fair.
So there is this sort of bargaining power there that women in polygynous relationships have. To speak to the point you make about, polyandry, I think what's key in that argument, from sort of me playing the sort of devil's advocate here, would be that that one of the central reasons for polygamy within fundamentalist Mormonism is to produce as many children as possible. You can't have as many children in a polyandrous marriage as you can in a polygynous one, because one man can have multiple women pregnant at the same time. But in a polyandrous marriage, there's only, a woman is pregnant for 9 months and then she has a baby. It's probably going to take a few more months before she can get pregnant again. So there's a limit to the number of children. So if one of the religious reasons why people are practicing plural marriage is in order to have large families, polyandry really isn't the answer to that. And that's not to say that polyandry doesn't occur. Polyandry does exist in some parts of the world, specifically in the Himalayas. Some parts of Africa as well do practice polyandry, but it's usually, polygyny is usually the way that polygamous relationships are practiced, because a central part of that is the issue of procreation and having as many children as possible.
Well, and women having autonomy and ability to decide with whom and whether or not they even want to have a child, I think reduces the locus of power that is held on that idea of one man can have multiple wives because he can have all of them pregnant at the same time. Well, if each and every woman is deciding to what extent she wants to have a child, or if she doesn't want to carry children at all, I think it removes that focus of power.
And it also, another thing that's worth mentioning as well is that occasionally there are women who are in a plural marriage and find that they can't have children, they can't conceive, and short of using medical methods of intervention to help with fertility, it can be a very valuable part of her life to know that one of her sister wives can have children for her husband, and she can play a role in raising those children as well. And women who do find themselves unable to have their own children, gain a lot from that. Whereas otherwise, in a monogamous relationship, their choices are very much more limited. Even if medical intervention can't help a woman conceive, that adoption is open to them, of course, but there are more options available to them within a plural marriage, where they are another mother among a number who are raising children together in a household, despite the fact that children are often have more of an affinity to their biological mother, but they still see the other women in the family as mothers too. So there can be a lot of value in that, I think, as well, for women who find themselves unable to have their own children. And if
it takes a village to raise a child, it's really convenient if that whole village lives under the same roof, right? And eats every meal together. Yes. And I understand that there are certain social benefits as well to having polygamous families, where kids are growing up in larger families with multiple mothers, and they're able to weave together maybe a tighter family fabric than can otherwise be woven in a family where kids are being raised by daycares because both parents have to work to pay for the food on the table, right?
Yeah, and then it's having strangers looking after your children. One of the things that I really have observed working with plural families, that I actually have some personal experience of myself, is the large age gap between children. So I actually have, my youngest brother is 18 years younger than me, because my parents divorced, my mum remarried. So there's actually a gap between my sister and I, who were born in the sort of early to mid 80s, and then my brothers, who were born in the late 90s, early 2000. My youngest brother was born in 2000. So, I could have children the same age as my brother, children of my own. The legal age of consent and the legal age to marry in the UK is 16. So I could have legitimately been married at 17 and had a child a year later, and had a child the same age as my brother. And so you see this a lot in fundamentalist families, where they do have, a man can have grandchildren who are older than some of his own children, because his older children might be in their 20s, but he's still having children who are born, but his older children are married and have children of their own. So there's this really beautiful sort of tapestry of children who are aunties and uncles and cousins and brothers and sisters, and all sort of living together as one big family. And I think it's quite fun, and I think it gives the children a lot of sort of exposure to the different age groups to big families. It gives them a lot of social skills that you don't see with children who come from very small families, especially only children who can sometimes have a very slow social development. And you just don't see that with children in large families in Mormon fundamentalist families.
And those kids always have somewhere to go. They always have someone to play with. They always have, whether it's their biological mom or it's their, one of their other mothers. They always have someone they can go to talk to, and it just offers a different version of the family dynamic that most of us are not used to. And to impose or claim that one system is superior to the other system is falling into the same dynamics that have kept polygamy outlawed and have allowed people to be, let's just say, allowed people to be oppressed and subjugated by people like a Brigham Young or like a Warren Jeffs, who are truly unpleasant people, truly evil human beings who committed crimes, who did things that were oppressive, and who had these underage relationships that are simply abhorrent and disgusting, and they go counter to everything that we feel should be okay and acceptable in our, just in the way that we are constructed as human beings. And because these things have been outlawed, people don't have anywhere to go when something happens to them. They don't have the legal protections when they are abused within a system like this. And obviously, the legal system has a hard time. Its hands are tied in many cases because when they've raided these fundamentalist groups in these polygamous colonies, it's bad for everybody. It looks really bad. It's bad PR for the state. It's bad PR for the government. And it's infringing on people's religious practices, which is already dancing on some really weird legal lines in America. And it makes it so that if people are abused, they don't have anywhere that they can go. They can't go to the police officer. They can't go to authorities. They don't have any legal redress if a member of their family is in legal situation where they require that spousal privilege, that they don't want to testify against somebody because they're not a legally recognized spouse. Property rights, so many issues are wrapped up into this. And the longer that, this is my opinion, the longer we keep it criminalized, the more this practice is driven underground, and, corruption is bred in darkness. And that's bad things happen when these things are criminalized and all of these practices are kept only in the underground. And that leads me to, I think, what should be our final question, because I've taken so much of your time today. There are two camps about the legalization, the decriminalization and hopefully legalization of polygamy. There are people who want to keep it criminalized, who want to for the system to remain what it is and impose harsher sentences and harsher punishments for practicing polygamy. And there are people who, like your paper argues, say that decriminalization is on the way. It just needs to happen. Just a few more bills, a few more, Supreme Court cases, and we'll be there. What are the two arguments? What reasoning do people use to say this should continue to remain criminalized and even harsher penalized?
So those who are arguing to say we need to keep it a criminal act, and in some cases, make more prosecutions, are the people who often, they bring out these tropes and the stereotypes. They cite people like Warren Jeffs and say, well, abuse, like child abuse and rape and domestic abuse and coercion are endemic within Mormon fundamentalist communities. That is absolutely not the case. In fact, data suggests that more abuse is more prevalent statistically in monogamous families than it is in polygamous ones, because women in polygamous families have access to more female networks and support systems. Obviously, the case with Warren Jeffs and what he did down in Short Creek
is an outlier.
Exactly. He was able to enforce a level of power coercion and control over people because of the law being the way it is, because he was able to, threaten women and say, well, if you do leave, your children are going to be taken from you. You'll be arrested. You'll go to prison. He used the law against people to stop them from leaving abusive relationships. And that he traveled a lot of the time. He would travel to Utah and sanction marriages there and carry out marriage ceremonies there, because he was using the laxer laws in Utah in Nevada, in order to sort of skirt around the law, so that if it came to it, he could say, well, actually, this marriage would be legal in this state where it's not in Utah or Arizona, where rules are slightly different. So he was well aware of what was and was not allowed, and would take that to its extremes. And he was an awful, evil man and deserves to be where he is right now and die in jail. But he is often brought out by people who are on the, let's keep it illegal camp. For those who are arguing for decriminalization, they're saying, it should be legal for consenting adults who are going into the marriage on their own free will, and they've gone in with their eyes open. They're not being coerced. Obviously, let's not allow underage marriage. Let's not allow children to be married off into polygamous relationships. And a lot of them cite, the Lawrence v. Texas ruling, that's just to keep the government out of our bedrooms. The government doesn't need to be controlling what happens behind closed doors between consenting adults.
100% agreed.
And so other arguments for decriminalization, talk about these, the strong female networks, the fact that these families are often living in fear of prosecution, even though the children are well looked after. The women and the men in the marriage are, fully consenting adults, but they just want to be able to live their lives without being in fear that the police will show up at their door and start investigating, or a house has been sold across the street and new neighbors are going to come in and start sort of wondering what's going on across the road in that house. And so it does drive people underground, or even, some of the people that I've spent time with live in sort of very quiet neighborhoods at the end of a block or something like that, where they can sort of keep out the way. And some of their neighbors might not actually know that they're practicing polygamists, because not all of the wives live under the same roof, or it's a split level house where there's one wife below who passes herself off as a single mother, and then the husband is, from the outside looking as if he's living upstairs with his wife, but actually he has two wives who live in separate parts of the same house. So, it just means people can stop having to live in the shadows, that their children don't have to sort of suffer either, that they can, be brought up with not needing to worry about what they say if they're asked a question in school, and they don't need to, face bullying. I mean, I remember growing up as a child of divorce and being bullied in school in the 80s and 90s for being a child of divorce in the UK. And I don't think that happens now. I mean, I think it's about 50% of marriages end in divorce in the UK, and children aren't stigmatized now in schools for being the children of divorced parents. I mean, it's not a thing anymore in the UK where I grew up and where I'm now currently living, having spent 5 years in the US. Obviously, things are different in different states in the US. Being the child of divorce in some states is not a big deal. It is in others. But the only way to start changing public opinion is to show just how normal these people are, and that they really are doing the best they can to raise their children. And they have the same struggles and marital issues and financial concerns as any other family, whether they're straight or gay or interracial couples. Everyone has the same marital problems. that they can work through and can strengthen their marriage, or it can end in divorce. And these, polygamist families have the same issues as monogamous ones, but they have more of them because there's more people in the relationship. So they sometimes have to work harder, but sometimes it's easier for them because of the number of people and the support networks they have. So I sort of went on a bit of a tangent from your original question of these two different sides of the issue.
But it's all related and it's all relevant.
And I think that, there are a lot more arguments in the sort of decriminalization camp than there are for the let's keep things the way they are, or even sort of impose stronger laws. But the thing so just very briefly to mention the way things went in Canada recently. So in Canada, there was this question of whether plural marriage or banning plural marriage was constitutional or not, and there was a legal case. So the trouble was that the polygamist groups couldn't afford to hire expensive legal counsel to represent themselves. Right. So the groups who are saying, no, let's keep the ban, let's prevent it, they had the money and the power behind them to put, expensive lawyers forward and expert witnesses to say, this is doing damage. But the people who are actually practicing plural marriage and who are living it often can't afford to hire, these big hotshot lawyers. So they often have to rely on expert witnesses. And I know, for example, Alina Darga was invited to give evidence in the Canadian case based on her experiences in her own marriage. But the problem is that with that legal case in Canada is that the pro-polygamy groups really didn't have the resources to put on the same legal front as the anti-polygamy groups. So it sort of skewed the presentation of what was going on in court because it just boiled down to money and who had access to it at the end of the day. So even though the people who are against legalizing or decriminalizing polygamy don't have as many arguments, and their arguments I would say aren't quite as strong as those who are arguing for decriminalization, they often have the money behind them, which can be problematic.
So then that leads to my final question. If I said that the last question was the final question, well, let's just amend that. That was the penultimate question. Final question then. In your view, given the wealth of research that you have conducted, the groups that you have worked with and talked to and done your various ethnography research on, what does the perfect polygamous case going to the Supreme Court look like to you, Philippa?
Oh, good question. You just really, you can't really pin it down because there's such a diversity within the way different plural marriages are practiced, and each of them are as valid as the last or the next. So it's like saying, well, how would you define or how would you present the perfect monogamous family unit? I don't think you can, because it comes in so many different shapes and sizes that there isn't just one answer to it all. I mean, obviously, I think in order to negate any concerns about, underage marriage and things like that, a case, a test case if it was to come through in the same way that Reynolds was meant to come through and make a Supreme Court decision to legalize polygamy, because that's what they thought. They thought Reynolds was the perfect example. He had a high standing reputation in the church. He'd been a private secretary to Brigham Young. He was in his 30s, had a stable job, wasn't super well off, but had was well off enough to keep and support his family.
His wives weren't teenagers.
And his wives were. his wives, he was in his early 30s and his wives were of a comparable age. So it from the outside looking in, or from the inside looking as what they were presenting to the outside, he looked like the perfect model of a polygamous family. He wasn't Brigham Young with all of, many wives. He wasn't a man who was living outside his means, and he wasn't a man who had women who were, 10, 15, 20, 30 years his junior as wives. It was a small family unit, him with two wives of comparable age, and that didn't work. So I just don't think I can't really sort of pin down what the ideal test case family would look like, because I don't think there is an ideal family. I think there are so many different ways that a polygamous family can look the same as a monogamous one. And I don't think it's for me to sort of say, I think so long as we can, demonstrate that if it was, hypothetically, if it was to get to that stage, so long as the family can be found not to have committed any, crimes in the past. So there's no underage marriage that has happened. There's no evidence of fraud. It would have to be a financially stable family that haven't, because the detractors will come in and say, well, they were claiming, food stamps for a while, or they were, there were a drain on Social Security resources. In order to get rid of those detractors from making those arguments, it would probably have to be a family that hadn't needed to use those sort of resources and were fairly financially secure. They'd have to be
absolutely squeaky clean, with illegally speaking, with taking any government subsidies that way. They would have to be the absolute perfect example.
And I think but the detractors would jump on anything, like a speeding ticket or something like that. It would be, well, these are not upstanding citizens. That person was convicted of speeding, or, so we'd have to be very careful and see it. But I'm not sure that we'll get to that stage where it needs to be this sort of perfect example of something that might not even actually exist, of this perfect family, because what family is perfect? But I think in today's world, where families do come in all different shapes and sizes, and that you've got this case of serial monogamy really that occurs today. The term monogamy is a little bit of a misnomer, because humans don't mate for life, or not very many of them do. So it's more like serial monogamy that's going on. Both of my parents have been married twice. They're both serial monogamists, and so I come from a family where I could arguably say that I had 4 parents, and and a half brother and step brother, and all of these different sort of family makeup. That it's very rare, I think, today, where you see this sort of husband and wife married for the majority of their adulthood with 2.4 children. That's kind of something you see in a 1950s magazine.
Exactly.
And I'm not sure that really exists in today's world, and nor should it, because I think every family lives and thrives on its individuality. And polygamous families are just the same. And I've seen some really, really happy polygamous families where the children have so much love and support. And I've seen every polygamous family. I'm not saying that every polygamous family is like that, but every family that I've seen, and the families that have invited me into their homes, I've just seen nothing but loving, caring families. And I can't say the same thing about monogamists. I have to say, there's a lot of really unhappy monogamous families who are unhappy and have unhappy children and things like that. So it's not sunshine and rainbows in any family. And I think if a family tried to say that their life was all sunshine and rainbows, they'd be lying. Does the perfect family or test case family exist. I don't think it does, because I don't think a perfect family exists ever.
Wow. Very well said. She is a doctoral researcher at the University of Exeter, researching, obviously, the realities of Mormon polygamy as it's practiced today and the media representations of Mormon polygamy. And everything that we have heard today in this conversation, as well as in last week's episode, is exactly her research. Philippa Meek, I want to thank you so much for sharing so much of your time with us today. You have been so very enlightening, and I've really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. In case listeners missed it at the end of last week's episode, can you give us a plug where people can find not only where to reach you personally, but also a bit of your research?
So I try and put as much of my research as possible on the academia.edu website. Search my name. It'll come up. My first name is, there's many ways of spelling it, but it's spelled Philippa. And my last name, Meek, Meek. Search for me on the academia.edu website. And there aren't many other people with my name, so I'm a pretty easy person to find. A lot of the research I do is there. I try and upload all of the papers that I present at conferences or things that I publish to that website. I've got a little bit behind because I've been to 9 conferences this year, and I've moved internationally, so I need to get on top of that. So that's where most of my publicly accessible materials are. I'm also on Twitter, and that's really the best way for people to reach me if they're interested in my research and want to talk to me more about it. And particularly for anyone who is interested in taking part in my research, if there are plural families out there who would like to talk to me about the realities of their lifestyle and their family, then I would be interested in talking to them. And Twitter is a good way to reach out to me. So my Twitter handle is my name. It's at, and then Philippa J Meek. So that's PhilippaJmeek. And that is where to reach me on Twitter. I often put links to my research on my Twitter page as well, and share, various news stories and other people's research that's relevant to mine. So that's also a good resource for anyone who's just interested in learning more about what I do specifically and other people who research in my area. But yeah, that's a really good way to reach out to me. So people who are interested in continuing conversations about their own families with me, I can get more personal details like emails and phone numbers to them through Twitter if they reach out.
Fantastic. And I want to offer a retrospective apology for repeatedly saying Meeks instead of Meek. My mistake. I just wasn't paying attention, and I made a mistake when I wrote the show notes originally. So I've been calling you Meeks for most of the time. Once again, I'm sorry.
I think you need it.
Okay. All right. Oh, that makes me feel a little bit better. Regardless, thank you so much for spending a lot of time with us. I've learned a lot, and I am thoroughly looking forward to keeping an eye on your research as it continues to develop and you continue to contribute to this rich field of Mormon polygamy ethnography, because there's a lot of work to be done, and you are one of the people on the forefront who's doing that research. And for doing that research and for sharing it with the world, putting it out there publicly available on academia.edu, which listeners, you're going to find links to her Twitter handle as well as her academia page in the show notes. Thank you for doing the work that you do, Philippa.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. It's been a pleasure to get to talk about my research just without abandon, just because I always like to talk about myself and my research, and don't often get many opportunities to talk about it that much. So thank you for
Most
having
certainly,
me.
The pleasure, trust me, was all mine. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Once again, a huge thanks to Philippa Meek for sharing so much information and devoting so much of her very precious time to discuss these massive topics with some serious and large and controversial questions wrapped up into them. Once again, as you heard in the end of the interview, you're going to find all of her information linked up in the show notes. If you want to find out more about her research, read any of her papers, and even to contact her directly should you have any more questions based on the interview and the discussion that we had today and with part 1 last week. Once again, I'm out on the road right now, so I'm recording this ahead of time, so I'm unable to thank the newest patrons that we have over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, but if you'd like to join their ranks and become a part of the NAMO family, be sure to do that, where you get access to a ton of extra content on the Patreon exclusive feed. As little as $1 an episode, a cup of coffee per month gains you access to a ton of extra content. Final announcement, it is just a few days before the March for the Children. This is the Protect Every Child March happening in downtown Salt Lake City on October 5th. This is conference weekend. The weekend of conference, the March to Protect Every Child is shutting down downtown Salt Lake City with thousands of people marching through the streets to stop child abuse happening in the church. This is a worthy cause. If you are able to attend, it is once again October 5th. Information is in the show notes, or Google Protect Every Child and you'll find all the information available there. It would be really wonderful to see you there in the crowd, to meet you face to face in support of this very worthwhile cause that has not met, the church has not met the demands of the Protect Every Child petitions. And this is with hopes that they will eventually acquiesce to those requests. And they're not requests, they're demands. Child abuse is happening in the church, and that has to stop. October 5th, are you going to be there? Am I going to see you? If you're in Utah, or if you're able to travel, make it happen, and maybe I'll see you in the crowd, and I'd love to shake your hand and meet you in person. Once again, information is in the show notes. We're going to go ahead and shut down for this week. Thank you all so much for joining us. Next week, I'm not sure, once again, I'm recording this ahead of time. I'd like to air the presentation that I gave at John Whitmer Historical Association. Once again, I'm not aware of what the recording requirements are for those for those presentations. I'm going to work with the organizers of John Whitmer to get that presentation out to you. And if not, then maybe I'll just redo the presentation here for you on the podcast feed without the 22.5-minute time limit that was required of the actual presentation itself. Regardless, thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you for lending me your ear, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.